In the withering summer heat, beneath the drape of Spanish moss, a plantation known as Magnolia Hill stood as a monument of Southern wealth. Its mistress, Elizabeth Hargrove, was the most envied woman in Baldwin County. But when the census taker arrived one autumn morning, he noted something peculiar. The plantation housed fewer people than it should. 31 slaves had vanished, erased without record, without burial, without a trace. Neighbors whispered of illness, of fever, of cholera carried by stagnant swamps. Yet not a single grave was dug, not a coffin nailed shut. Instead, the earth remained undisturbed, as if the land itself had swallowed them whole. But there was something else, a detail omitted from the official report. The night before the disappearances, townsfolk claimed they heard faint singing carried through the fields, followed by the unmistakable sound of water sloshing, splashing, echoing unnaturally far. Magnolia Hill had a secret bathhouse built behind the main quarters, where Elizabeth was said to cleanse herself not in solitude, but in ritual. Each night, she entered the steaming water with chosen men from the fields. Their bodies became instruments in her strange ablutions, their presence both servitude and sacrifice. What happened in that water was never meant to be recorded, but the silence of Magnolia Hill is itself an indictment. A plantation vanished into shame, a lady's name buried in ash, and what remains? Only whispers of the baths. Elizabeth Hargrove was not the portrait of fragility so often painted of Southern women. She was statuesque, commanding, with porcelain skin that burned too easily beneath the Georgia sun. She inherited Magnolia Hill from her late husband, who died mysteriously only 3 years after their marriage. His will left her in sole control of over 200 acres of cotton and nearly 60 enslaved men and women. Her neighbors described her as refined, eloquent, with manners suited for Charleston parlors, but her reputation was tarnished by a private eccentricity that grew harder to conceal. She disdained church attendance, dismissing sermons as hollow words spoken by hollow men. She hosted no teas, attended no socials. She kept to her estate, isolating herself in a rhythm of strange habits. Slaves whispered that Mistress Elizabeth bathed not once, but thrice daily, scrubbing her skin raw until it glowed pink. These were not ordinary baths, but rituals of command. In the evenings, she called for men from the fields, always the strongest, always the youngest, to accompany her to the secluded house behind the orchards. The doors would lock, water would steam, hours would pass. When the men returned, their eyes seemed different. They moved slower, spoke less, as if something inside them had been drained. But the deeper horror was this: some men never returned at all. And though questions were asked, no answers ever came, because who in Baldwin County dared accuse a white mistress of Magnolia Hill? Milledgeville was the nearest town, a seat of politics and gossip, a place where reputations rose and fell like tides. It was also a town bound by silence, for silence was the glue that kept old wealth from crumbling. Elizabeth's reputation as an eccentric was tolerated, even excused, because her plantation produced more cotton than most. She paid her tithes, donated to the church roof fund, and kept up the illusion of genteel benevolence. Her strange routines were dismissed as the sensitivities of widowhood, but the whispers spread nonetheless. Draymen at the market spoke of wagons arriving at Magnolia Hill, carrying barrels of lime, though no new buildings were ever constructed. Hunters swore they saw lights flickering from the orchard bathhouse at ungodly hours, shadows moving against the windows like writhing figures. And then there were the sounds, songs that seemed neither hymns nor field calls, voices rising from the estate after midnight, so faint yet so chilling that even dogs refused to bark. Still the townsfolk turned their faces away. To ask questions was to invite danger, not from Elizabeth herself, but from the system she embodied. To accuse her was to accuse the institution that fed them all, that gave them land, wealth, power. Better to let the whispers rot in the dark than let the truth bleed into daylight. But deep down, everyone knew something was happening on Magnolia Hill, something unholy, something no polite society could ever confess. Behind Magnolia Hill stood a structure unlike the barns, smokehouses, or mills common to plantations. It was built of thick timber, its roof shingled in slate imported from Virginia, its windows barred with iron rather than glass. Locals called it the bathhouse, though few had ever seen inside. Slaves described it in hushed tones as a place of heat and dread. A brick furnace kept water boiling day and night, so that steam poured from its chimney even in summer. The floors were lined with stone, slick with condensation, and the air reeked of mineral salts. At the center was a pool, rectangular, sunken, filled not with clear water but with a cloudy mixture of herbs, oils, and something else they could never name. Elizabeth would enter unclothed, her pale figure glowing like ivory in the lamplight. She commanded men to join her, stripped of dignity, stripped of choice. What happened inside blurred the line between ritual and torment. Sometimes she would simply wash herself against their skin, as though their bodies were cloth. At other times she whispered prayers in Latin, a language she was not known to speak. The water grew darker with each session, stained with substances not easily named. Witnesses claimed the men emerged trembling, silent, their muscles weakened, as if something had been siphoned from them. The unlucky never came out at all, and when the bathhouse door finally swung open, Elizabeth walked free, radiant, her skin shimmering, her eyes glassy with satisfaction, while the silence of the fields grew heavier. For those enslaved on Magnolia Hill, survival depended on silence. Yet silence bred its own kind of speech, coded whispers carried in the night, stories murmured in broken dialects. Fragments passed from cabin to cabin. They called Elizabeth the Pale Serpent, a name both feared and spat with bitterness. To them, the bathhouse was not merely a chamber of water, but a mouth that swallowed men whole. "The water eat them," one elder said, like river spirits hungry for flesh. Children were warned never to look toward the orchard after sunset. Women clutched their sons when Elizabeth's maid came with summons, praying their names would not be chosen. Some slaves tried running, fleeing into swamps thick with mosquitoes and snakes, but many were caught by dogs and returned, whipped near to death, then ordered into the bathhouse as punishment. And there were signs, disturbing, undeniable signs. Strange welts appeared on the skin of survivors, shaped like fingerprints though burned into flesh. Some men aged rapidly, their hair turning gray in weeks, their teeth loosening as if decades had passed overnight. Others lost speech altogether, muttering only fragments of Elizabeth's whispered Latin as if possessed. The overseer, a gaunt man named Pritchard, enforced obedience with brutal precision, ensuring no word of the rituals reached beyond the estate. He told the slaves that Mistress Elizabeth was cleansing herself of the rot of sin, and that to resist was to resist God's will. But the slaves knew differently. They knew sin did not cleanse, it consumed, and the bathhouse was not God's sanctuary. It was his absence. The summer of 1839 became the year Magnolia Hill lost nearly half its enslaved men. It began subtly, one gone in May, two in June, then entire groups missing by July. When August came, the fields thinned. Rows of cotton sagged without hands to pluck them, yet Elizabeth reported no sales, no deaths, no transfers. Officially, 31 men vanished. Unofficially, the number was higher. Women swore their husbands had been summoned and never returned. Children went fatherless overnight. No graves were dug, no funerals allowed. The sheriff of Baldwin County asked questions, but Elizabeth was untouchable. She entertained him with sweet tea on her porch, her voice lilting with feigned sorrow. "They've run off," she claimed. "I fear the swamps will take them." She offered to pay for advertisements in Savannah papers for the fugitives. The sheriff nodded, appeased, and left satisfied. But the truth was more sinister. Survivors whispered that on the night of the disappearances, Elizabeth called 10 men into the bathhouse at once. Witnesses claimed steam rose so high it looked like fire from afar, and the sound of chanting carried on the wind. The men's screams lasted until dawn, then fell silent forever. By autumn, Magnolia Hill stood quiet, its wealth preserved but its human life diminished. Elizabeth appeared paler than ever, yet oddly vibrant, as if she had drunk deeply from the essence of others. The town noted the disappearances in murmurs, but recorded them as runaways, sealing the silence. What truly happened that summer was scrubbed from paper, but not from memory, and thus began the legend of the Lady's Bath, Every plantation had an overseer, but few held power like Samuel Pritchard. Tall, skeletal, his skin perpetually yellowed from laudanum. He was less a man than a shadow that stalked Magnolia Hill. Slaves feared his whip, but feared more his loyalty to Elizabeth, which bordered on devotion. Pritchard claimed he was bound to her by an oath. He often muttered in the fields about the cleansing, insisting Elizabeth's rituals were ordained, that they preserved the plantation's fortune. When questioned by neighbors about the missing men, Pritchard's answer was always the same. They chose their path. Mistress only guides them to the water. At night, he became Elizabeth's silent sentinel. He stood guard outside the bathhouse while steam hissed from the roof, refusing to let even the bravest approach. Some slaves swore they saw him kneel in prayer, his head bent toward the locked doors as if worshiping what occurred inside. But his loyalty was not without cost. One night in September 1839, he emerged from the bathhouse, drenched, trembling. His eyes clouded white. For days he could not speak, only cough up salt water as though he had drowned on dry land. When he finally recovered, he bore scars across his chest, marks too symmetrical to be natural. From that moment on, the slaves whispered that Pritchard was no longer a man, but a vessel, a chosen guardian infected by Elizabeth's rituals. He lived, but lived as half-human, half-thing, his will bound to hers. And so the silence of Magnolia Hill endured, not merely by fear, but by something more insidious, worship disguised as duty. If there was one institution expected to question Elizabeth's practices, it should have been the church. Yet the Baptist congregation of Milledgeville never uttered her name from the pulpit. Reverend Thomas Avery, a stern man with a booming voice, had been seen visiting Magnolia Hill on several occasions. Though he spoke fire against dancing, drinking, and Sabbath breaking, his sermon skirted Elizabeth's reputation. Instead, he praised her charitable gifts and devotion to personal purity. Some claimed the Reverend himself had entered the bathhouse one winter evening, carrying a leather-bound Bible under his arm. He stayed for hours. When he returned to town, his voice had grown hoarse, his sermons quieter, his gaze oddly unfocused. Yet he defended Elizabeth with renewed vigor, calling her a daughter of discipline, misunderstood by lesser souls. Behind closed doors, parishioners whispered of a darker pact. The church's coffers swelled with donations, its steeple rebuilt with Magnolia Hill's cotton money. In exchange, silence. For the slaves, this betrayal cut deepest. To them, the church had always been a bitter promise of salvation denied. Now it stood not only as indifferent, but complicit. And when Elizabeth's bathhouse rituals were likened by some to baptism, a corruption of sacred water, a desecration of holy rites, the Reverend answered with words that chilled even his most devout followers. God's water cleanses in ways beyond your understanding. From then on, the church was not merely silent. It was a shield, protecting Elizabeth's abominations from the light of judgment. In November 1839, an orphan boy named Caleb wandered into Magnolia Hill. He was 12 years old, the son of a poor farmhand who had died of fever. With no family to claim him, he drifted from farm to farm, begging for bread. Elizabeth took him in. She clothed him in fine linen, fed him at her own table, and placed him under the care of Pritchard. To the townsfolk, this act cemented her image as a benevolent widow. The Lady of Magnolia Hill, they said, takes pity on the lost. But the slaves knew differently. They saw the way Elizabeth watched the boy, her pale eyes lingering too long, her touch resting too heavily on his shoulder. They knew he would not remain innocent. Caleb became her errand runner, carrying small glass bottles to and from the bathhouse. Sometimes he returned with jugs of cloudy water, which he poured into the orchard soil where nothing ever grew. He began to speak strange phrases, fragments of Elizabeth's whispered Latin. Though he had never been taught, one night, a cabin woman swore she saw the boy inside the bathhouse standing waist-deep in water, his body trembling as Elizabeth held his face beneath the surface. He did not drown. When he emerged, his lips were blue, yet he smiled faintly as though blessed. By December, Caleb's eyes were hollow, his voice distant. He no longer answered to his name. The town praised Elizabeth's charity. The slaves whispered that she had not saved him. She had claimed him. And thus the boy became another silent instrument in her ritual. By winter, Magnolia Hill had grown quieter than ever. The fields lay fallow, abandoned after the disappearances. Fires burned constantly in the bathhouse, the smoke curling black against the pale sky. Snow came late that year, but when it fell, the orchard behind the house remained bare. Not a flake touched the soil. Instead, the ground steamed, as if heat rose from beneath. Travelers on the road swore they smelled ash, mixed with the sickly sweetness of burning flesh. Elizabeth grew thinner, yet her skin glowed with unnatural vibrancy, as though the cold could not touch her. At church gatherings, people remarked on her radiance, though no one could explain why her breath never showed in the frosty air. Children clutched their mother's skirts when she passed. Dogs barked furiously at her scent. One evening in January, Pritchard ordered 3 slaves to carry barrels of ash from the bathhouse to the river. They tipped them into the current, the water running gray for miles downstream. The next morning, dead fish floated to the surface, their eyes clouded, their bodies swollen. The slaves whispered that the missing men had not simply vanished, they had been reduced to ash. Their bodies burned in secret furnaces beneath the bathhouse. Elizabeth, they said, was feeding on their essence, distilling it into the water she bathed in. By February, whole families prayed to be sold away, anywhere but Magnolia Hill. Yet no one dared confront Elizabeth, for the plantation's silence had now grown into the town's silence, and the town's silence had grown into the church's silence. The winter became a season of dread, and still the bathhouse fires never died. In March 1840, months after the Great Disappearance, a figure staggered into Milledgeville from the direction of Magnolia Hill. His clothes were torn, his feet bleeding, his body trembling with fever. It was Josiah, one of the field hands believed to have vanished the previous summer. He had been summoned to the bathhouse with 9 others, never to be seen again. Yet here he was, alive but scarcely human. His skin was blistered with strange burns as though water had scalded him from the inside out. His hair was streaked gray, though he was only 22. His eyes, once sharp, had gone glassy, unfocused, as though he stared not at the world, but through it. When townsfolk brought him before the sheriff, Josiah spoke in fragments. He whispered of water that breathes, of Elizabeth's pale body glowing in the steam, of voices that sang from beneath the pool itself. He claimed the men who entered with him had dissolved, their screams muffled by boiling water. He alone had crawled out in the dark, dragging himself through the orchard like a ghost. The sheriff dismissed him as delirious, blaming fever and swamp air. But the slaves knew his story was true. They gathered around him in secret, listening to his broken words. And then, just as quickly as he had returned, Josiah died, collapsing one night with water pouring from his lungs, drowning on dry earth. His body was buried without ceremony. His name struck from the plantation ledger, but his brief return planted a seed of terror. What Elizabeth was doing in that bathhouse did not end with death. It reached beyond it. Later that spring, another event seared itself into memory. The slaves called it the midnight procession. On a night with no moon, Pritchard roused nearly every man and woman from their cabins. Elizabeth, clothed in white silk, led them barefoot to the bathhouse. She carried a lantern, its light sickly yellow, casting her face in shadows that seemed carved from bone. Inside, the great pool steamed furiously. The water smelled not of herbs, but of iron, like blood and rust mingled together. Elizabeth ordered the slaves to stand in silence while she entered the pool. Then, one by one, she pointed at them. Some were forced to kneel at the edge to dip their hands into the water. Others were commanded to sing hymns in voices choked with fear. Those who touched the water cried out as though burned. Welts rose on their skin, shaped like hands reaching from beneath the surface. The singers' voices broke, yet they could not stop. Elizabeth moved among them, her hair plastered to her pale shoulders, her eyes glowing with something beyond human. She whispered in tongues no one recognized, yet the walls of the bathhouse seemed to echo her words. When dawn broke, the procession ended. The slaves stumbled back to their cabins, trembling, their throats raw. No one spoke of it openly again, but the memory lingered like smoke in their lungs. And for months afterward, the bathhouse fires burned brighter, as if fed by more than wood. Not all turned a blind eye. In July 1840, a stranger arrived in Milledgeville, traveling from Savannah under the pretense of surveying plantations. His name was Dr. Alistair Kavanaugh, a physician known for his interest in peculiar maladies. Kavanaugh had heard whispers of Magnolia Hill, men vanishing, slaves returning broken, and a mistress whose body seemed untouched by age. Intrigued, he sought Elizabeth's acquaintance, presenting himself as a scholar of medicine and theology. Elizabeth welcomed him, flattered by his curiosity. For weeks he stayed at Magnolia Hill, observing with a calm detachment. He asked to see the bathhouse but was denied. Instead, he was allowed to examine the illnesses of the slaves. He found burns that resembled immersion in scalding liquid, rapid aging consistent with extreme trauma, and faint symbols carved into the skin, marks that no whip or chain could make. At night, he kept a journal recording strange phenomena, lights flickering in the orchard, the sound of voices chanting when no one was near. The way Elizabeth's reflection in mirrors seemed delayed, lagging half a second behind her movements. By August, Kavanaugh grew convinced that Elizabeth's rituals were neither simple cruelty nor madness. He believed she had discovered a perverse form of alchemy, feeding on the essence of those forced into the bath. He confided his suspicions to the sheriff, but was met with silence. Soon after, Kavanaugh himself disappeared. His luggage remained at the inn. His journal was found in the reeds by the river, its last page smudged with water, the words nearly erased. The water lives. It calls to her. It calls to me. His name was never spoken again in Baldwin County. By late 1840, Magnolia Hill had become both a source of fascination and dread. Rumors spread beyond Baldwin County, carried by merchants and travelers, but within the town itself, denial became law. The cotton harvests diminished, yet Elizabeth remained wealthy, her accounts flush. When asked how she prospered, she merely smiled and said, "The Lord provides." Her generosity kept the town beholden. New pews for the church, supplies for the school, food for the poor. Every gift was a chain of silence. Yet signs of corruption could not be ignored. Animals refused to drink from the river downstream of Magnolia Hill. Children woke screaming from nightmares of drowning. Some townsfolk swore Elizabeth's shadow no longer matched her form, twisting unnaturally when she walked. Still, when questions arose, they were dismissed. "She is a widow," they said. "She suffers strangely, but she means no harm." To accuse her was to accuse the foundations of their society, to unravel wealth, tradition, and pride. The slaves, however, could not afford denial. They lived in the bathhouse's shadow daily, breathing the smoke of its fires, hearing the songs no one else would hear. They knew denial was not protection, it was complicity, and so Magnolia Hill stood unchallenged, its mistress untouchable. But denial cannot last forever. Secrets rot, silence breaks, and the truth always claws its way out of the water. By the autumn of 1841, the enslaved people of Magnolia Hill could endure no more. The disappearances, the processions, the endless fires of the bathhouse. It was as though they lived inside a mouth that chewed them alive. A plan formed in whispers. The bathhouse itself must be destroyed. One night, when Elizabeth was away visiting a neighbor, 3 men crept into the orchard with torches. They smashed the barred windows, hurling fire into the steaming chamber. The flames rose quickly, licking the roof, the furnace roaring like an angry beast. But as the structure began to burn, something strange happened. The water boiled over, spilling onto the stone floor, extinguishing the torches with a hiss. Steam poured out in a thick white cloud, so dense it blinded them. The men stumbled back, coughing. Out of the haze, they swore they saw Elizabeth herself, though she was miles away. Her figure stood in the doorway, eyes glowing, her lips moving silently. When the smoke cleared, the bathhouse still stood. Not a board had burned. The men fled into the woods, never to return. By morning, Elizabeth had resumed her rituals as if nothing had occurred. The rebellion had failed. Worse, it confirmed the slaves' deepest fear. The bathhouse could not be destroyed by fire or hand. It was bound to something greater, something older than them all. From then on, resistance gave way to resignation. Escape was impossible. Death was inevitable, and the bathhouse remained eternal. Not all bowed to silence. Among the enslaved was a woman named Ruth, old and unbroken, who had lived long enough to see the rise and fall of 3 generations. One night, she stood in the cabin doorway and told the others what they already feared. This water is not hers. It belongs to something that was here before her. She feeds it, and it feeds her. Her words spread quickly, and with them hope. Ruth believed that if the source of the water could be found and cut off, the bathhouse would lose its power. She spoke of underground springs, cursed rivers, spirits bound by blood. But speaking was itself a crime. Pritchard heard of her defiance and dragged her before Elizabeth. The mistress listened in silence as Ruth repeated her claim. For a moment, Elizabeth's composure cracked. Her eyes flickered with unease, her hand tightening against her gown. Then, with a calm voice, Elizabeth ordered Ruth into the bathhouse. The others begged for mercy, but the doors closed, the steam rose, and Ruth was never seen again. Yet her final words lingered. It is not her power. It is borrowed, and all debts must be paid. The slaves carried that truth in silence, waiting for the day the debt would come due. By 1842, Elizabeth herself began to change. Though her skin remained unnaturally radiant, her body weakened. She walked with a stiffness in her joints, her movements jerky, as though her limbs no longer obeyed her. At times, townsfolk swore they saw her reflection move differently from her body, a half-second delay that made them avert their eyes. Children said her smile lasted too long, stretching even after her face had stilled. Inside Magnolia Hill, the slaves noticed something stranger. The bathhouse fires grew harder to control. Flames flared suddenly, scorching the walls. The water boiled without fuel, and at night voices echoed even when Elizabeth was absent. Some said the water no longer obeyed her. It demanded her. Elizabeth responded with greater cruelty, summoning more men, forcing longer rituals, whispering faster prayers. But her desperation betrayed her. She was no longer the calm mistress of ritual. She was a supplicant, clinging to a bargain she could not uphold. One evening, Pritchard found her collapsed by the pool, gasping for air. He carried her to the house, but her skin was blistered, her hair falling in clumps. Still, by dawn, she rose again, as radiant as ever. It became clear the bathhouse was no longer her tool. It was her master, and cracks had begun to spread, not just in Elizabeth's body, but in the silence of Magnolia Hill. The summer of 1843 brought the end. On a sweltering July night, Elizabeth summoned every remaining slave to the bathhouse. Pritchard stood at her side, gaunt and trembling, his eyes white with devotion. Caleb, the orphan boy, now grown pale and hollow, carried lanterns that cast the orchard in a sickly glow. Elizabeth's voice shook as she spoke. Tonight, the waters shall claim what is owed. Tonight I shall be whole again. The slaves were herded inside. The pool bubbled violently, glowing faintly from within, as though lit by fire beneath the earth. The stench of sulfur filled the air. Elizabeth entered the water, arms outstretched, chanting in her broken Latin. Then the ground trembled. The pool surged upward, water splashing across the stone floor, burning wherever it touched. The slaves screamed, pulling back, but Pritchard forced them forward, shoving bodies into the boiling depths. Caleb's hollow eyes flickered as though trapped between pity and obedience. But the water did not accept the offering. It roared, spilling higher, striking Elizabeth herself. She shrieked, her pale skin blistering, her body sinking into the pool as though pulled from below. Her final scream echoed like 100 voices at once, then cut short. When the water stilled, Elizabeth was gone. Only her gown floated on the surface, burned to ash within seconds. The bathhouse shook violently, cracks racing across the stone. The slaves fled into the night as the roof collapsed. Steam poured upward in a column, visible for miles. By morning, Magnolia Hill was silent. The bathhouse was a heap of charred ruin, the pool reduced to a pit of scorched earth, and Elizabeth Hawthorne was never seen again. The collapse of Magnolia Hill did not end its story. For years afterward, travelers passing through Baldwin County spoke of strange sights in the abandoned orchard. Steam rising from bare soil, water bubbling up though no spring lay beneath, shadows flickering without cause. The slaves who survived fled in every direction. Some sold to neighboring plantations, others vanishing into swamps. They carried with them fragments of Ruth's final prophecy, that debts must be paid. Their descendants whispered the tale as warning, never trust the water that sings. The townsfolk, however, buried the story. Official records claimed Elizabeth died of fever, her plantation abandoned for lack of heirs. The church preached silence. The sheriff forbade gossip. Magnolia Hill became a wound the county covered with dirt, pretending nothing had festered there. But denial cannot erase memory. Children dared each other to trespass into the orchard, to touch the stones that still pulsed faintly with warmth. Some returned pale, trembling, unable to speak. A few never returned at all, and in the river downstream the fish never came back.